So in my opinion, quantum biology, or biology in the beginning of 21st century, is somewhat parallel to what physics was more than 100 years ago, at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. More or less a vast edifice of lots of data, lots of information, lots of descriptive information and analysis, but not so much a unifying concept. Physics actually had already at that time a lot of conceptual background, starting with Newton's mechanics and electromagnetism, Maxwell's electromagnetism. Thermodynamics was developed in the 19th century for industrial applications and heat engines and so on. But at the end of the 19th century, there was a feeling that physics was complete. There was nothing more to be discovered. And then suddenly there were a few strange phenomena that nobody could explain, and that turned the tide, and suddenly something completely new emerged from this. And a few people, actually a handful of people, made the quantum revolution in physics. They are more or less represented on this slide. Starting from actually 1900 and until actually 1940s, there was a complete change in the way physicists view the universe and matter in particular. And the people who are shown on this photograph actually built this new field of quantum physics, which later on developed into quantum field theory and unified quantum field theories. The process is still ongoing because gravitational theory is not part of unified quantum field theory. So it's not completely done, but it's been quite a job over the century or so. So these people, and you may recognize some faces: Marie Curie, Max Planck, Albert Einstein in the middle, the lower row. Actually, he was a rebel among these distinguished scientists, because until his dying days, he never believed in quantum mechanics. Anyway, I'm going to talk about biology, because biology today is also facing some challenges. It has amassed a lot of information, as I said, but has not made a lot of sense out of it. Especially as we move from the molecular foundations of biology all the way to cell biology and beyond, there are some very peculiar features which we call emergent phenomena that you cannot basically extrapolate from the building blocks. You cannot extrapolate the behavior of a whole cell based on the structure of the organelles. There is synchronization, coherence, overarching behavior of a living cell that you cannot really extrapolate from individual parts of the cell. So that actually obsessed a lot of physicists for many years, the question, what is life? And I think to answer that question, we still don't know really what is life in the most fundamental sense. But to be able to answer this question, we'll probably need quantum mechanics at some stage. And today and on Thursday, I'll show some examples where we think we can be looking for quantum effects in living systems, glimpses of it at least. Okay, so that's the historical introduction. Since most of you, if not all of you, are not physicists, I owe you an introduction into quantum mechanics at a level that you can appreciate without going into too much detail. But nonetheless, since this is about quantum biology, we need to cover the basis. What is quantum physics? Quantum physics is very different from classical physics, which all of us, at least intuitively, understand physics at the level of Newton's equations. That is, we perceive matter as solid objects that move through space with velocities, have positions, and they have some momenta when they move, momentum, mass times velocity. And forces act on objects or between objects, and forces affect acceleration and their positions. So that's basically, in a few sentences, the Newtonian image of matter. It applies even today, of course, to most of the everyday experiences, but if you look down to the constituent particles of matter, this image is completely inadequate. Namely, at the microscopic level, elementary particles such as electrons and protons and neutrons and subatomic particles, they do not really have this quantity of solidness. You cannot represent an electron as a ball with given dimensions, although you can ascribe to it a mass and some sort of size, but once an electron is observed or moving, it's not in a given place. It's actually distributed throughout, and in principle to infinity. It's more like a cloud than a ping pong ball, if you want to think in terms of images. So the first thing is, by and large, quantum mechanics applies to microscopic objects, as this slide indicates, but not completely. There are some exceptions to this rule. There are some macroscopic systems where quantum mechanics is definitely at play, and I listed a few here. We'll get to it later on as well. So the first objection, as you will hear later on, to biology not being quantum, that this is too big for quantum effects, is not necessarily true. Because, first of all, quantum applies to large objects, even microscopic, such as lasers. And I'm sure we have lasers all over this classroom, and you're familiar with lasers. Even when you go to a supermarket to buy some groceries, the scanners employ lasers. Lasers are quantum phenomena. And the second thing that quantum initially implied was not only small systems, but systems at almost 0 Kelvin, absolute zero temperature. That means minus 273 Celsius. At this temperature, there is really no thermal noise. And biological systems, of course, are not alive at minus 273. You have to heat them up. We need room temperature. We exist, of course, rather comfortably at 0 Celsius, but the colder the temperature, the harder it gets, and the human body will not function if you freeze it below. Can you help me with this? What would be the absolute, if you go down with the body temperature to 34, maybe you would be clinically dead, right? Very, very close to that. For a few minutes, I don't know how long, but anyway, we need this temperature which is given to us by energy, which will be a recurring theme in my discussion. So temperature is created by metabolic processes. Metabolic processes use up energy, nutrients in particular. That's not the case with physics. Physical systems exist at all temperatures, and quantum mechanics, as I said, applies principally to very small microscopic systems at very low temperatures, principally at 0 Kelvin, but some of the quantum effects persist to higher temperatures. So these microscopic phenomena that I mentioned, superfluids, superconductors, you must have heard about superconductors. Maybe we're not using superconductors in our daily activities, but scientifically superconductors are used also in medical instruments and squids and so on. Lasers. But even in situations where we don't have to go to extreme to exotic phenomena such as these, quantum effects manifest themselves in various ways. So all crystals, and you must have seen a crystal in a souvenir shop, for example, beautifully arranged molecules in a regular lattice. Crystals have properties that actually, even at room temperature, show that the vibrations of the crystal lattice are quantized. Okay. So, quantum mechanics is called quantum. Actually, initially it was called wave mechanics, because of this property I described to you that microscopic systems are not rigid objects like ping pong balls or golf balls, but they are more like clouds, moving clouds or wave-like. And to describe this initially mathematically, physicists used wave mechanics. mechanics of fluids. That was the initial approach to it. That's why it was called wave mechanics, later on quantum mechanics. Quantum is because energy is quantized. That means it's used and produced in packets, integer numbers of quanta, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you cannot have a 3.7 number of quanta. Okay, so that's very different from classical physics. You can think of energy consumption of computers or electric devices, washing machines, but you never think about these machines or devices using quantum amounts of energy. 1 watt, 2 watts, 3, no, it doesn't make sense, right? But at the level of microscopic, so atoms, atomic level, molecular level, energy is quantized. All right. So things get really weird. I only gave you a taste of what quantum mechanics is, but it really gets weird when you try to use intuition to understand quantum objects. And one of these weird things is it's called wave-particle duality. That actually neither a wave nor a particle is an adequate description of an electron or a proton. It's both. It depends on the context, on which experiment you're performing. An electron can behave like a particle that collides with another particle and sets the other one in motion on collision, but it can also behave like a wave when it's going through a diffraction grating or a double slit. So particles can penetrate through two openings, two holes, at the same time. If this is not weird, then I don't know what is, right? Can you think of a ping pong ball that goes through both doors? If you open, if you open these two doors, it would go at the same time through both. Is this imaginable? Not easily, right? You have to change the picture. It's not a ball anymore. Actually, it's a wave. It's a cloud. So you can think about a particle as having cloud-like qualities under some circumstances. If you want to force it to go through one of the other doors, well, then it'll fool you. Next, now how to understand all of this? We have to move away from the determinism of classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, where you actually, if given, and this is a famous statement by the famous French mathematician physicist Laplace, who said that given the coordinates of all atoms in the universe, positions and momenta, he can predict the future of the universe. Actually, he was wrong. You can't do that because of quantum mechanics. So Newtonian equations are deterministic. That is, you can, given these initial conditions and the positions of the molecules, you can predict the evolution of the system. But in quantum mechanics, you can only predict the probability that the system will be here or there, but you cannot predict with certainty where it will be. And even weirder, you cannot verify that, because once you measure the system, you always interfere with it. So if you want to determine the position of a particle, you lose complete information about its momentum. In other words, if you try to find out where the electron is, and you can capture it, you lost information about how fast it was going. Or vice versa. If you measure the velocity, you lost information about position. It's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's a fundamental law of the universe, if you wish. It's not something that we can improve by making more precise measurements, refining your tools, or taking more measurements of the same system more and more. So there is something stated here about the observer problem. The observer cannot be disentangled from the system that is being measured. Recently, there were even articles demonstrating that a mere attention paid to the system changes the system's behavior. So this is really weird stuff where consciousness enters into the world of subatomic physics. Not measuring, but just observing it without any interference with it affects the way it behaves. Oh, sorry. Heisenberg uncertainty principle. There's an equation, inequality. It simply tells you that there's a limit to a simultaneous measurement of position and momentum. It also, there's an equivalent statement about other so-called complementary variables. Position and momentum are two complementary physical variables. In quantum mechanics, we don't call them variables, we call them observables, because you can observe them. Another pair of complementary observables in physics is energy and time. So if you precisely measure the energy of a system, you don't know when it happened or when it is now at this energy level. And another pair of complementary observables is the angle, if a system is rotating, angle and angular momentum. Angular momentum is equivalent to linear momentum for rotating systems. And finally, two spin variables. So that's another weird thing. I didn't mention that, but magnetism, one of the oldest physical phenomena known to man, known to ancient Egyptians and Greeks. Magnetism is a pure quantum phenomenon. There is no classical magnetism. You cannot have magnetic particles just by putting masses in motion. You have to have something called spin, which was discovered in trying to give the date, first half of 20th century. I don't remember, 1948 or something like this, by Pauli, Wolfgang Pauli, a physicist genius who was also somewhat mentally unstable. But that's very common, I guess, when when you talk about genius. Genius usually is linked with some other out of the ordinary qualities. Yeah. So anyway, Wolfgang Pauli discovered spin, and spin explains magnetism, and there's also a theorem showing that there is no magnetism in classical physics. Okay, but the most important experiment, the most important contribution to quantum mechanics was made by Max Planck. You may have heard about Max Planck Institutes in Germany, a very prestigious scientific organization. He was actually, at the time, one of the most senior physicists in Europe, professor in Göttingen, and was working on explaining so-called black body radiation. At finite temperature, all objects, including our bodies, but also the table, the floor, the walls, any object at finite temperature emits radiation, electromagnetic radiation. And this electromagnetic radiation has a spectrum. That is, the intensity of the radiation depends on the frequency. And this was very carefully measured for various objects, and nobody could really explain the shape of the spectrum, because we're all assuming classical electromagnetism. There is a bunch of oscillating dipoles, and they emit all kinds of frequencies with no constraints. Well, Max Planck, I mean, luckily he was a senior scientist and highly regarded at the time, because I think if somebody junior came up with this idea, he would be probably kicked out of the university. But Max Planck was senior, and he proposed, almost against his own conviction, that there's something else going on, that these electromagnetic oscillators are allowed to only emit energy packets with quantum values, as I told you. 1 quantum, 2 quanta, 3 quanta, 4 quanta, but no possibility of 1.5 or 3.7 or 4.8. It was completely ad hoc. And when that was implemented, this formula was calculated by him. The intensity of electromagnetic radiation is a function of wavelength lambda. And he had to put in by hand a constant called Planck constant now, h. And this is a fundamental constant of nature. There is no explanation for it. It's God-given. It simply is. Just like the speed of light. So there's another fundamental constant there, c. 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. And so 2 constants, one known at the time, speed of light measured, and the Planck constant, new constant. And most importantly, perhaps, in addition to the quantization of energy levels, a relationship between energy and frequency. It's called the Planck formula. Energy is proportional to the frequency of electromagnetic radiation. E equals h times f frequency. So you have a simple way of quantifying, measuring how much energy light has, for example. If you know the wavelength of light, you can calculate from the formula c, speed of light, equals frequency times wavelength, f times lambda. If you know lambda, you know the frequency, and vice versa. And from that, you can calculate the energy. Energy is the Planck constant times the frequency. Again, almost out of nowhere. So, what is this telling us? The first experiment, blackbody radiation, people tried, couldn't explain it in classical terms. Max Planck invented quantum mechanics to explain this one experiment. And then everything kind of, the floodgates opened and many other experiments followed that required quantum assumptions. The blackbody radiation experiment, to me, is somewhat similar to metabolism in living systems, because it has to do with energy transfer. Here we have energy from electromagnetic radiation in physics. In living systems, energy is produced by biochemical reactions. But in plants, it's actually the same thing. In plants, you have the photosynthetic production of energy from light, right? Plants have chlorophyll, we'll see, and they can harness electromagnetic energy directly through a chain of biochemical reactions and transfer it into quantum excitations. This is actually the statement that I just made is very recent. And nobody could have said it 10 years ago even, because I think in the 2007 or 8, in these years, this was actually demonstrated experimentally and theoretically that photosynthesis is a quantum phenomenon. You cannot explain photosynthesis with classical chemical reactions or any sort of physical processes. It is a quantum process. So it's a fundamental process, right? If plants, think about this, if plants came up with quantum mechanics as an efficient way of harvesting energy from light, I think we're a bit more evolved than plants, right? I would be very surprised if the evolution process stopped at plants in terms of quantum. Then forget, right? Animals don't know about quantum, but plants do, yeah, sure. The second, so it's actually very good that I have the slide about the photoelectric effect, because the photoelectric effect is a physical process very similar to photosynthesis. Simpler, much simpler. But it was complicated enough for Einstein to get the Nobel Prize for it. In case you didn't know, this is exactly what Einstein came up with. He wrote 4 fundamental papers in 1 year, 1905. It was called the Annus Mirabilis, miraculous year in Latin. Because in 1905, Einstein produced 4 papers that changed completely the way we view the universe. Special relativity, photoelectric effect, and also wrote a paper on Brownian motion. All important. This actually was, I wouldn't say the least important of the 3, but not the most important. The special relativity paper, which changed, the conception of the space-time, basically, right? That space and time are not independent; they are conjoined. That was a revolution. For this, he didn't get the Nobel Prize. But for the photoelectric effect, he did. So what is the photoelectric effect? It is a measurement of current going between two electrodes in vacuum, which were subjected to electromagnetic radiation at different frequencies. If the frequency was too low, no current flowed. At above a threshold, current was observed. And so Einstein explained this as follows. Since Planck came up with the idea that light or electromagnetic radiation in general carries energy, this energy is absorbed by the metal surface, and the electrons which are sitting on the surface, when the energy is strong enough or high enough, they will be ejected from the surface and allowed to flow from the electrode, from the negative to the positive electrode, basically, as a result of the electric field producing a force. Okay, so that's the explanation. The novelty here is, first of all, that confirms Planck's idea that light carries energy. Secondly, that electrons are bound to the metal surface by a potential energy that has a finite value, and this value corresponds to the threshold of the light energy. It's called the work function. Okay, so there are many other experiments that confirm quantum mechanics, and actually we are, even today, some of these more exotic properties of quantum mechanics are still disputed and being confirmed by various precise and subtle experiments. But at that time, these other four were sort of fundamental to our understanding of the importance of quantum mechanics at the microscopic level. The Compton effect. So this was an effect where a ray of light was observed to hit an electron, and then the electron started moving at a particular velocity. You can calculate what it is and in which direction. But the main thing is that in this experiment, light behaves like a particle. A quantum of light is called a photon. Right? Photons, in this connection with hitting stationary particles, behave like other particles. Sometimes particles behave like waves, and sometimes waves like particles. Okay? So that's this duality again. The second, probably you're familiar with this one because it's discussed even in high school physics, atomic spectra. Right? So if you have an atom, you have the nucleus with protons and neutrons, and then you have the Niels Bohr model of the atom where electrons occupy orbits almost like a solar system, right? Electrons circle around the nucleus. It's a oversimplification, but you can think about it like that. And what's important is that electrons circle the nucleus like planets circle the sun, but only at very specific orbits. And you can jump from one orbit to the next if you give electrons energy, electromagnetic energy, light, but at specific frequencies. And these frequencies were measured precisely in the beginning of 20th century, which then validated the Bohr model. Of course, Niels Bohr got a Nobel Prize. Almost every experiment I'm talking about and every theoretical explanation that was proposed was given a Nobel Prize. So these were fundamental discoveries. I have to say that we don't hear about these kinds of discoveries very often. I think the last one, to my knowledge, was DNA, discovery of the double helix structure of DNA about 50 years ago. I think we are now giving Nobel Prizes for incremental contributions to our knowledge. These were fundamental contributions to our knowledge. And double slit experiment, this is what I told you about, particles behaving like waves, moving through both slits at the same time. That completely defied classical picture of these rigid particles. And finally, the so-called Stern-Gerlach experiment, named after two German physicists, Stern and Gerlach, showed that magnetic fields could separate electrons moving between the two magnets into and curving their trajectories up or down depending on the orientation of the spin. Spin is like a magnetic needle for an electron. Each electron has a magnetic needle called spin. I mentioned this importance of spin, and this needle responds to external magnetic fields, orients itself. Okay. A bit more introduction, but I'll sail through it rather rapidly because it gets a bit technical. I think for now it was descriptive, but you have to move from descriptive to quantitative, otherwise there is no quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics is almost like an area of mathematics because it cannot be derived from anything else. So there are postulates made to make it into a self-consistent discipline of science. And so the first postulate of quantum mechanics is to assign a mathematical function called a wave function to any microscopic object. If you think about golf balls, you think about their position on the golf field and maybe how fast they are moving. That is no longer the case with quantum mechanics. You have a wave function that is the distribution of the, later on you'll see, probability where this golf ball or electron may be in space and time. So we have to change our thinking completely and describe physical objects by wave functions, psi. The second postulate has to do with the interpretation of the wave function, namely the square of the wave function multiplied by the element of volume gives you the probability of this particle being somewhere in space, specific area of space. Let's move on. There are very important mathematical properties of the wave functions, and you can guess they have to be square integrable. All right. This is even weirder. In physics, yeah, you can measure velocity, you can measure energy even, you can measure angular momentum, a lot of things. But in quantum mechanics, you have to replace these mundane properties with, again, mathematical objects. They're called operators. It's a linear algebra of operators in Hilbert space. Okay, that's a technical term. The operators are Hermitian, and there are very specific definitions of what that means. And for those of you who are not into advanced math, you can just gloss over it. But the only thing I want to say is, very luckily, Hilbert spaces, Hermitian operators, and all of this exotic mathematics was developed in the 19th century. Conveniently for physics, about 100 years before physics needed it, mathematics already prepared the ground. So it was just the sophistication of the physicists who eventually grabbed that body of mathematics and used it for the description of the universe that saved the day. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. So anyway, these mundane observables or physical properties are replaced by Hermitian operators. Operator of position, operator of momentum is actually partial derivative with respect to position. And then the energy, your potential and kinetic energy in classical physics, is replaced by a function, very important, the most important function in quantum mechanics, called the Hamiltonian. These names originate, of course, from the names of the mathematicians or physicists who came up with it. So Hamilton was the originator of the Hamiltonian in classical mechanics. He was an Irish professor of mathematics, one of the youngest full professors of mathematics ever. I think he was, at 23, he was professor of mathematics, I think at Trinity College, but I may be wrong on this. Okay, and the fourth, the most fundamental of these postulates is how you solve the problem of the universe, of these particles. In other words, how do you predict where particles will be the next instant? In classical physics, it's Newton's equations of motion, right? In quantum equations, Newton's equations have no place. Instead, Erwin Schrödinger, who was an Austrian physicist, came up with a replacement of Newton's equations. It's called the Schrödinger equation. And of course, he got a Nobel Prize for this. What else? And the equation is written on the board, on the screen. And that's more or less it. You just, so what it does is gives you a time evolution of the wave function from which you can calculate the probability distribution where a particle might be depending on where it was at time 0. And you have to give the conditions, namely, is there an electric field, is there a magnetic field, is there any obstacles, or, so you can put it all into the equation. The first term in the equation, the square bracket, is the kinetic energy. Second derivative with respect to space, it's the square of momentum in quantum mechanics. And the second term, V of x, is potential energy. If you know the potential energy and the kinetic energy, you know everything about the particle. But in terms of probabilities only, because it's not deterministic. Okay. And now I'm going to fast forward a little bit. This is more or less all you need to solve quantum problems. But yeah, you have to know how to solve partial differential equations. It makes it a bit technical. I told you that there are some cases where quantum mechanics actually can be manifested in large objects at room temperature or even higher. And this is under the banner quantum theory of solids. Solid objects also manifest quantum properties. I told you about magnetism. Magnets are absolutely quantum. Crystals. Crystal lattices at finite temperature they vibrate. So this is kind of a schematic of a crystal lattice. What's unexpected, and actually this is the one case where Albert Einstein made a mistake. He tried to solve the problem of what is the heat capacity or specific heat of a solid, crystal. And he assumed that all the atoms forming a crystal vibrate at the same frequency, each one independently, and did the calculation and obtained a formula which actually does not correspond to experimental observation. This is what he did. He used the Planck equation. Planck constant, omega is the frequency, and n is the number of quantum. So observations from experiment actually indicated the specific heat, which is the amount of heat per temperature to raise the temperature of a solid by 1 degree. How much heat do you have to put into it? You boil water for tea and so on. That's exactly this kind of experiment. To 100 degrees Celsius from 20 room temperature. How long with the given power? Okay. You can do this for solids easily. At very low temperatures, close to 0, specific heat of solids depends on the third power of temperature, absolute temperature. At high temperatures, reaches a constant value. And this was the puzzle that Albert Einstein tried to solve, and he failed. He obtained an exponential dependence on temperature, not cubic, which actually applies to gases, not solids. So somebody else solved this problem. It was Paul Debye, a French scientist with whom I believe Marie Curie had an affair, but that's a long time ago. And but he got a Nobel Prize. I guess it's normal by now, right? Everybody who participated in these events got a Nobel Prize just by association. Okay, so that was Einstein's model. Failed model. Einstein's model of specific heat of solids. You see the exponential. It's a different formula. The Debye model solved it. Why am I saying this? Okay, I started by telling you that today biology resembles physics about 100 years ago. There are a few examples, we'll come to these examples, where things are not really that's simple. We can't explain this or that. And remember, I told you that one of the most important experiments that proved quantum mechanics correct was the photoelectric effect. Light striking a metal plate, ejecting electrons, going to the other electrode. Okay. Photosynthesis is very similar to this. And now, a few years ago, this was explained by quantum mechanics. Okay? There's more. The second thing that is very similar is specific heat of solids. I told you about the specific heat of solids being explained by, and I probably didn't explain it well enough, collective motion of crystal lattices. It's not that each atom vibrates independently, but there are waves moving through the solid, through the crystal. Okay. Once you make this assumption, that's what Debye did, you obtain the correct formula. That means the whole solid is coherent. It's not each atom separately. And that is very analogous to metabolism in organisms. If you go from single cell living systems like bacteria or single cell organisms like paramecium to multi-cell, to plants, to animals, there's something called allometric scaling laws. In other words, depending on the size of the object, there is a different demand on energy, right? Because all living systems require energy for life. Whether it be plants or animals or humans, we have to have a certain amount of calories consumed to sustain life. The question is, how does caloric requirement depend on the size? Do you think that an elephant that is let's say 50 times larger than an average human requires 50 times as much food? Would you say yes? You're right. It doesn't go this way. No. Scaling law, the so-called allometric scaling law between organisms, from bacteria all the way to elephants, is a 3/4 power law, roughly speaking, around 0.75. In other words, if you increase the size 16 times, quartic root of 16 is 2, you need 8 times as much nutrient. 2 to the power 3 is 8, right? So it's not 16 times, it's 8. And depending on the ratio, you get the different number from the formula. Okay, so why am I saying this? Because it's very similar to the specific heat of solids. Heat is energy intake causing a temperature increase in a solid. Metabolism is nutrient intake causing physiological processes maintaining life for a living system. It's a summary of microscopic quantum effects. I'm trying to tell you again that quantum mechanics, although originally designed for electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, neutrinos, can and does apply to large systems. Okay, we're coming to the end of today, and the best is left for Thursday. But so quantum mechanics and life. I kind of indicated to you that it would be very paradoxical, to say the least, that as humans, as a civilization, I think we've been here 10,000 years as a civilization, maybe as intelligent species for a few 100,000 years perhaps. It took us that time to figure out quantum mechanics. Life had 2 billion years on this planet to experiment in parallel on multiple copies of experimental design for every conceivable species, and we are so arrogant to say that life on the planet did not solve the quantum problem. I think it did, especially since quantum mechanics is very useful It offers some very interesting possibilities. I'm not even going into the exotic domain of things like telepathy, and maybe I'll mention on Thursday, conscious phenomena, intuition, extrasensory perception, that without quantum mechanics we cannot simply deal with rational explanations of these things. But even for mundane things, it's very useful because quantum systems can do parallel computations, for example. So much faster, much more computation at the same time. It can also explain coherence, which means being in sync. As an organism, we feel unity, right? We feel coherence, that your toe and your ear belong to the same organism. They are not disconnected. If you try to explain these things by sort of linear concepts of signal transduction and biochemical reactions, it makes it a very daunting task, to say the least, not to mention very slow. Yet we perceive external stimuli incredibly sensitively, which would defy some of this even more. Okay. So these are the 5 gifts of quantum mechanics to nature. If nature wanted to take advantage of the gifts, we don't know for sure. I think it did for plants for sure. Some of our senses are most likely operating at the threshold of quantum level. So countability, again the quanta, stability, there is a sense of stability of the system. Quantum information allows very rapid and huge storage of information. And we are still, of course, as a civilization trying to design quantum computers. You may have followed this. It's in the popular literature. Occasionally hear about some quantum computing being done in Vancouver. There's a company called D-Wave that has created a quantum computer. And they are very useful in things like encryption. So information processing and dealing with randomness. Actually, sometimes in some quantum phenomena, thermal noise and randomness are advantageous. They allow the system to explore nearby states or trajectories, which otherwise the system would get stuck in. It's like agitating a particle trapped in a potential. If you agitate it, it may actually tunnel out of the potential or go to the next level and maybe tunnel back. So you can process information back and forth at very little cost. In fact, environmental noise might allow you to harness this kind of energy for positive purposes. And of course, as a physicist, as my ultimate argument for quantum mechanics, that everything reduces to elementary particles. So we are not built from other elements. It's all the same elements that are used by Mother Nature for other purposes. So we have, of course, the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, and some metal ions here and there. Of course, dimensions matter. And strictly speaking, science has evolved based on these hierarchies of spatial and temporal scales, right? So there are perhaps artificial boundaries between fields of scientific endeavor. At the bottom you have elementary particle physics, where quarks make nucleons, and that's almost an independent area of physics where you actually have to solve relativistic quantum equations. Then we have condensed matter physics, solids, where electrons and protons make a solid. Of course, deep down you have a fine structure of matter, of these particles, nuclei, but by and large you can ignore it because nuclei are deeply buried inside the atom. And then when you go into chemistry, only small molecules, sufficiently small to be described by current means, utilize quantum physics. There's a branch of chemistry called quantum chemistry. And so, as I said, small enough molecules can be very well described by quantum phenomena. Going into macromolecules is difficult. It's not because there is some insurmountable obstacle. It's simply our computational resources are not sufficient to keep track of all the quantum wave functions. And beyond small molecule chemistry, I think going into biochemistry and cell biology, strictly speaking, quantum representation of the building blocks vanish. But again, maybe we should not be so quick to remove the quantum degrees of freedom. We do that mainly for practical purposes, not for some major conceptual problems. And this is, I'm going to probably finish this talk with one number for you to remember, which explains why these boundaries exist between fields. Okay? So now listen to me carefully for maybe 3 minutes. There's a combinatorial barrier that cannot be ever overcome. To whatever we try to accomplish as scientists or researchers, there are some insurmountable barriers, one of which is the combinatorial barrier posed by the so-called immense number. Immense number coined by a mathematician named Elsasser. Why is that so? It's 10 to the power 110. It's a huge number, but I can come up with examples of bigger numbers than this. So why is 10 to the power 110 a number that cannot be overcome by computational means anywhere at any time? Because imagine the entire universe being one big computer. Actually, some people are talking about this, that we live in a matrix, right? That the entire universe is a matrix. You don't have any freedom. You have no free will. You're just an element, a little ant in the universe, okay? In this matrix. You just follow the herd in the matrix. But I'm talking about something else. Suppose every hydrogen atom in the universe is a computational element, like in a computer, that can have a bit of information. It can be up or spin up or down, 0 or 1. Okay? Imagine every hydrogen atom in the universe is part of a huge computer, yourself included. You have a lot of atoms in yourself, and every hydrogen or other heavy atom, oxygen, is performing computations even as we speak. Then imagine that this huge computer, composed of the entire universe, is performing computation for the entire duration of the universe, which is 18 billion years. Turn it into periods of flipping back and forth of these bits, and suppose that you do it at the level of a picosecond, 10 to the minus 12. It's really quantum transitions. Quantum transitions occur at this time scale, 10 to the minus 12. You do the multiplication, the entire universe running for the age of the universe in picoseconds as discrete time steps, up, down, up, down, up, down. It's 10 to the power 110. In other words, if you can come up with a set of objects which has 10 to the power 110 elements, the entire universe as a computer would never be able to inspect the set, let alone do anything with it. Is this exotic? No, because, for example, a protein, let's say a peptide, okay, a typical protein will have about 500 amino acids, okay? 500 amino acids, and there's 20 different amino acids to choose from, right? In nature, 20 different, alanine, glycine, leucine, blah, blah, blah. So if you have 500 positions, and in every position you have 20 possibilities, it's 20 to the power 500. It's larger than the immense number. So, in other words, theoretically, a set of mid-sized proteins is much bigger than an immense number. And therefore, even the entire universe could never, ever inspect this set. And that's why different fields of endeavor have been created to come up with shortcuts, because we cannot do combinatorially every single possibility. And I just gave you an example with proteins. The same with DNA. We have, human DNA has 9 billion base pairs. Each base pair has 4 possibilities. So 4 to the power 9 billion is easily more than immense. And the same thing applies to types of combinations of cells and so on and so forth. Game of chess, for example, is an immense number. You cannot make it algorithmic completely such that your computer would store all possible chess games. It's not possible. Even the universe, as a computer, could not store all chess games. Okay, so I'm stopping now. We'll come back to it on Thursday. I'll give you some examples where I think quantum effects shine in biology. And again, within this historical perspective, what I'm trying to tell you is that although there are very few currently well-documented examples of quantum behavior in biological systems, the same thing happened in physics just over 100 years ago, and today nobody doubts quantum mechanics as the most fundamental theory of the universe. Thank you. Correct quantum errors. You know, that's another error correction. Is another big area where you can transition a state from place to place, but then you have to be very careful not to disturb that state.
What you've asked about mind uploading, you know, our natural tendency is to think that there can be only one of us, and therefore if we upload our minds somewhere else, that it leaves from where we are. We can't make multiple copies. And I think if classical physics operates, then we can just make 1 million copies of our own mind and, you know, upload it. But maybe quantum principles would suggest that this idea that our consciousness is unique, and if we move it somewhere else, it leaves from where it is now.
Well, and back to Laplace, I think the uploading and so on is still, in my opinion, within the deterministic view of the universe.
Yeah.
The quantum is stochastic.
Yeah.
So there will always be the problem of decoherence, stochastic noise, and so on. Like, what is it that you're in? I kind of like the uniqueness of that.
Yeah, and I think when I started talking the other day about how multiple versions of yourself, if that felt to you like that cannot ever happen, then maybe you're thinking quantum mechanic thoughts. Because in my mind, you can't explain creating multiple versions of yourself in a quantum way. Whereas if it's just, you know, old-fashioned physics, you can. It's a computer file, and you make a copy, and you put it in somewhere. Yeah.
One last question. Looking at this last slide, do you see any pessimism with regard to the promises of big data? Because this slide, my imagination.
Yes, not pessimism, actually. Overhyped. This whole big data aspect overhyped, because big data is nothing compared to this. And as I say, even this supercomputer in Utah doing spying for the NSA and so on, it's a joke compared to what really can be encrypted, even in tiny bits of biological material.
Yeah.
So you still need human intelligence, I think, or sometimes intuition. I don't think that brute force, I mean, they're doing brute force, just brute force, and maybe some pattern recognition algorithms. There are barriers, real barriers to this. So that's optimistic. I don't want to be completely deciphered by somebody.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see you on Thursday.